Joining us now, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, Punchbowl News co-founder and MS Now political contributor Jake Sherman, and MS Now legal analyst and former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Barbara McQuade. Jake, it's not so surprising that we saw some fireworks today in the Judiciary Committee, especially when it comes to the Democrats, but Blanche's nomination is advancing. Now what happens, and when can we expect that Senate vote? Is it going to come this week?
It should come this week. It should come by Friday or Saturday at the latest. I mean, it depends. You know, this is the last week in session for the Senate, so they have a lot of business that's piled up. And Democrats have to decide if they want to be a party to some agreement to schedule votes ahead of when they would otherwise be, meaning not run that clock out to its end. So I would imagine that that vote will be either, sometime between now and Saturday, and Blanche is almost certain to be confirmed. And I would say the fireworks in Judiciary were completely expected. They were from Democrats. The real problem would have been if there were fireworks from Republicans, which there really weren't. And so, Thom Tillis and John Cornyn asked for these assurances on the audit immunity deal and on the weaponization fund. And they got it to their liking. I never thought, and I said a million times on air and in our newsletter, I thought Blanche was going to be confirmed. I didn't think that they were going to let him fail. And this deal, whether you like it or not, doesn't matter what we like or what we think is right. But Thom Tillis and John Cornyn thought it was bulletproof. I mean, I think there's legitimate arguments that it's not, that it does not put in stone the end of this weaponization fund, nor does it put limitations on that audit immunity case. But it was enough for Cornyn and Tillis to say yes, and they are the ones that have the votes. But again, important to note that, this is not like putting in law that there should be no weaponization fund. So
they couldn't possibly have thought, Jake, that this was bulletproof. I mean, what reason do they have to actually trust that, take Blanche at his word and trust that he's not going to renege on this agreement once he's actually in seat?
They don't, but they wanted to get to yes. And I think that's what's important. They wanted to get to yes. They didn't want to be no. And when you want to get to yes, you look at things through that lens. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
Ken, remind us about Blanche's history. Of course, we all are well aware that he was Trump's personal attorney, but give us a sense of what his record has been, what his career has looked like, and what that may foretell or portend for what we may see as he becomes AG, most likely.
Todd Blanche is a fascinating figure. He was a prosecutor for 9 years in the Southern District of New York, one of the premier U.S. attorney's offices in the nation, and he had a decent reputation when he went to work for Donald Trump, defending him in that New York fraud case. And he took a huge risk. He staked his career, essentially, on Donald Trump because he severed himself from his law firm at the time and went to work full-time as Donald Trump's defense attorney when it wasn't at all clear that Donald Trump's political career was going to continue. And what a gamble that was, because it really paid off for Todd Blanche. He's going to be the next attorney general. And I've talked to people who know him well who say that he thought he could come in the second term. He was first he was a deputy attorney general, essentially running the department, and run kind of a normal Justice Department the way it ran in the first Trump term. But it quickly became apparent that that was not how this Trump administration was going to run. And Todd Blanche made his peace with the fact that he's shattering decades of norms at the Justice Department. He's basically doing what the White House wants him to do. He was doing it as deputy, and he's been doing it as acting attorney general. He's pursuing investigations that many people think are specious. He's taking actions that many people find outrageous. Many of the employees in the department loathe what he's been doing. But you know what? At the end of the day, he's going to go down in history as one of the attorneys general of the United States. And that is the thing he'll have for the rest of his life that will probably give him earning power. And so from his perspective, his gamble to throw his chips in with Donald Trump really paid off, Ariel.
Barb, Democrats are clearly expressing concerns that the agreement inked by Todd Blanche won't hold any legal weight, that this was a political move meant to push through his nomination, but there are abundant loopholes that still exist in these documents. Is there anything legally binding in the agreement that he signed, and even the one he didn't sign when it comes to tax immunity, or his testimony in these hearings that Republicans can bank on?
No, this agreement is completely hollow. I cannot believe Senators Cornyn and Tillis were genuinely persuaded by this because it is completely lacking in any meaningful change. The first problem with this whole deal in the first place is that Todd Blanche is negotiating in a self-dealing manner. He was advised by ethics advisors that he must recuse himself from any matter involving Donald Trump. Instead, he is handing Donald Trump what amounts to $100 million in unpaid taxes. So a meaningful settlement would have been, number one, roll back the settlement completely and allow Donald Trump to refile his lawsuit when he is no longer the president and there is an objective adversity of parties on the other side. Number two, in terms of the slush fund, this fund is over, but the idea of paying some of the January 6th defendants is not. All this does is say the fund that was announced on May 8th is over. And we saw just last week the Justice Department pay out a 7-figure payout to a man from Tennessee who had blocked the entrance to an abortion clinic in violation of the law, who was convicted by a jury at trial. What would instead be more meaningful is to say that this Justice Department will not negotiate any settlements with a defendant convicted by the Biden administration without court oversight. Those would have been meaningful changes. Anything less is really just putting lipstick on a pig.
Ken, I do want to pivot here to get to the other big DOJ headline, the reflecting pool saga that we've all been following. And now we see this fissure between President Trump and his close ally, U.S. Attorney for D.C., Jeanine Pirro. It's been pretty shocking to see how starkly the president has treated this. You know, he said she choked, called her, a collapsed umbrella, or she folded like an umbrella. It's all because of her decision to drop the vandalism charges against a former Olympian and several others. Even Senator Kennedy, a Republican, joked that those former defendants could actually hit up the so-called anti-weaponization fund. Could they?
Well, if this was on the level, they sure could. I mean, this guy was facing 10 years in prison. And we now know from the latest filings from the Justice Department that not only was there no evidence to support the charges against him, there was exculpatory evidence that they were required to turn over under the Brady decision. And so there was misconduct on the line here. They had to do what they did. And Jeanine Pirro had to go to the White House and defend herself. The thing about this is that Donald Trump doesn't care about the facts, right? He just wants, he cares about the perception. And he told the public that this damage was the result of vandalism, and he wants to make his own reality. But when you go into court as prosecutors, you can't afford to do that. You could get in a lot of trouble if you misrepresent things before a judge. And so Jeanine Pirro, who is a former judge and a longtime prosecutor, had to do what she did, and now she's facing the consequences with the White House.
Barb, you know, irony aside, could those defendants use the so-called anti-weaponization moment to claim that the government was targeting them? Do they have a case? What would it look like?
Well, I think they could, except I doubt that this Justice Department is going to be in any mood to repay them. However, this administration will be out of office in 2 years. Typically, torts have a statute of limitations of 3 years. And so I think when we have a new administration, they would be well within their rights to seek compensation for what was clearly a partisan, baseless, lawless prosecution.
Ken, Jeanine Pirro was called over to the White House to have a meeting with President Trump. Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, was there as well. She had sort of blamed him and his office for not providing the evidence in this case. But she was seen, as you see in this video, carting out some boxes. It looks like a big white box. Any clue about what might be in it?
Well, when I saw that, I assumed that those would be the case files, the evidence that they had amassed about the fact that this damage was actually caused by contractor malfeasance and ineptitude. And in fact, there's been reporting that that's exactly what was in those boxes. So it looks like she went over there in an attempt to try to present the facts to the White House. Whether or not that succeeded is anybody's guess, because, again, Donald Trump doesn't care about those facts. But she's in a really difficult position because she's dealing in a world of facts and truth, and you have to go into court with evidence. And Donald Trump doesn't care about that.
Jake, last word. How is all of this landing on Capitol Hill? Are you hearing from lawmakers that are talking about this, or are they focused on Blanche, or actually their legislative priorities? What's going on?
Yeah, they don't care at all about this, about the pool issue. I mean, this couldn't be lower on anybody's areas of interest going into an election year they want to get their business done, get home, and try to keep their majorities. Republicans are clinging to their majorities in both chambers. They just don't have a ton of interest about this cutting of the reflection pool.